All right, welcome everyone to this week's edition of Elections Weekly. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and with us this week we have our regulars. We have Joe Szymanski, the Deputy Director of the Elections Team and Head of Interviews, and we have Dylan Wade, who is a contributor to Elections Daily and host of Popcorn Politics on Ocelli.com. We're happy to have both of them here. So today we're going to be going over, if you can see from the title, mainly the Bob Woodward stuff, which is just bizarre how this even happened. We're going to be going over this complete snafu with the Virginia 7th Congressional Convention. Just the whole congressional district there had a complete mix-up, and there are genuine problems that need to be addressed there. And we're also going to be going over some of the polling as we've been doing the last few weeks. We actually had a ton of polls, including just a gigantic drop of polls today from a Democratic-affiliated pollster, which basically showed what Toss-Up Bot has been telling us for the entire year, which is that everything is a toss-up. So I guess we're going to jump right into. Joe wrote about this earlier today, so I guess we'll start with the convention stuff in the 7th congressional district. So Joe wrote an article about this earlier today. It's a pretty quick read. You could actually probably read it while you're listening to the podcast, and I can go ahead and put that in the comments for anyone who's interested in reading that. But the gist of it is it's another in a long line of convention failures in Virginia. This unique nominating structure that is antiquated and probably needs to go away. Previously, the scandal in the 5th was of bribing voters and hosting it at someone's church. This is completely different this time, though. So I'll hand it to Joe to kind of explain what's been going on here.
Yeah, so news about this and that there were some issues about this came up around last Friday. Brendan Jarvis, who he's on Twitter. If you look him up, he's one of the better reporters of Virginia politics that are out there. And he came out with a report saying that there were reportedly 43 extra count ballots that were these were extra ballots. These are 43 ballots that should not have been counted, or should not have been a part of the count. There were 43 extra ballots that were putting the results of the 7th District Convention for the GOP in question. Now, there are a couple of big differences here between the 7th and the 5th. Those two conventions. One is that while the 5th was a drive-through convention, the 7th was a much more normal convention. All the delegates went to a single place. They hung out there for the day. Just instead of it being all inside, it was more like a party outside, and then you went into the convention center inside to go and vote. And then the other big thing is that the congressional race, which was was pretty highly focused on between Nick Freitas, John McGuire, and Tina Ramirez, including some other minor candidates. There were also multiple other elections on the ballot, the big one being for the State Central Committee for the GOP for the 7th District, which is pretty important in controlling how the 7th District GOP goes about and does their thing. The report is that 43 extra ballots were counted. We can confirm that. We can confirm that there were 43 extra ballots. And then with the source information that we got, it is quite likely that there are going to be lawsuits about this, mainly because the 7th District Chairman has not yet delivered the ballots to the Republican Party of Virginia headquarters, so that way they can actually be affirmed and counted, and that way everyone can be officially certified as the GOP candidate. And the other thing we also can confirm, though, from our source, that these are not likely to change the final results of the race between Freitas and McGuire. That was the final ballot race right there. That's not likely to change, but it does bring into question the entire convention. There is still some questioning whether or not McGuire or Ramirez could potentially challenge the results. Apparently, they are looking into that. And not only that, but the ballots have still not been delivered. Apparently, there are lawsuits being prepared potentially for tomorrow or the weekend. Obviously, I'll be trying to keep an eye out on that as much as I can, especially if they happen over the weekend. You'll certainly see something from our account, at least commenting on that. And then that's kind of really the whole drift. So it's really interesting that, of course, it's really the first time that Freitas has been involved in a situation with ballots that's not really his fault. Mm-hmm. It's not likely. We don't believe any type of corruption is a part of this, at least not from what I've heard or what I've seen. it seems to just be a legitimate mistake. But 43 extra ballots is a pretty big mistake, and that does put the entire convention in question. And that's definitely not something. And again, with the 5th district already happening, the Virginia GOP has been under scrutiny since 2017, just with choices of candidates and choices of nominations. So this is not really something that the state party wants to deal with right now, because they are a state party who has been severely weakened just by recent events over the years, and it just seems to be another one of those events that is going to continue to weaken the party.
Yep. And this whole convention thing, I mean, honestly, it's been even a decade of it. You obviously had the 2009 or the 2013 convention, where Bill Bowling was originally, not Bill Bowling, the lieutenant governor.
That was Bill Bowling.
Yeah, Bill Bowling. I thought I confused him with someone else, but Bill Bowling was the popular lieutenant governor. He was going to run for governor. This was agreed upon with Ed Gillespie with Bob McDonnell, the popular, although somewhat ethically challenged governor of Virginia. This was agreed upon that he would run for governor afterwards, but instead Ken Cuccinelli, an arch conservative, decided to run as well. And based on just the convention, Bill Bowling knew there was no way he could win and dropped out before the convention, rather than even if there had been a primary, the voters would have been able to decide. But even in this case, he dropped out because of pressure from a convention. And this has just been going on for a while. E.W. Jackson winning in 2013.
Yeah,
you had the 2017 stuff. You had this cycle, obviously, with the infamous Bob Good primary, where in a regular primary, Denver Riggleman probably wouldn't have had much of a problem. But when you have the convention literally being held at someone's church, and it's a drive-through convention, it's like there's problems. This one is not complete to the corruption of that, but it's just incompetence, which if you're going to hold a convention instead of a primary, you need to know what you're doing. And the fact that they're not even delivered the ballots yet is just kind of bizarre. It looks bad.
Yeah, like I said, without delivering the ballots, it makes it look worse and worse. And now we are hearing reports of lawsuits. Lawyers are being hired. We know that at least one side has hired lawyers. At least we believe the Republican Party of Virginia has hired lawyers to potentially be ready for lawsuits over this. So it's getting to a point where it's not just incompetence within the party. It's now just infighting within the party over how these structures are.
See, this feels like it's as doomed as the Democratic Iowa caucus was. This might be the last year for convention nominations in Virginia, just due to the magnitude of these two scandals.
And neither
Sorry.
of these are good. Neither of these give much credit to the concept of a convention.
No, I don't like the idea of conventions personally. I think they're really undemocratic, and even if it runs perfectly, it still looks corrupt for party insiders to choose their nominees.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, this issue, I'm frankly a little surprised there aren't more of these.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Virginia's the only state that does this. I mean, there's other states that are doing this sort of thing. This is a specific Virginia thing.
Yeah. I mean, but the thing, and it was really interesting because the state party doesn't decide it for these congressional races. It's the district party, which makes it an even more localized issue. If you remember, the 2nd District GOP, which also had an open primary this year, had a primary for to go take on Elaine Uriah in that district. They decided to have a primary. They did not have a convention for that. They sent it to the voters, in which Scott Taylor, who, while was probably not their favorite candidate overall, was by far the best candidate they had out of the three people who were running for the seat, and he won it pretty handily. The Republican voters said we will nominate Scott again. It's at least at the very least it's more democratic. We know that who the voters are choosing. Campaigns cannot target individuals like the Bob Good campaign is very much accused of targeting individual voters and basically bribing them to vote for Good.
Yeah, he
which
spent
paid
all
off in his favor because obviously, in a very highly contested race and well-known convention, Bob Good, won that pretty handily. So it's such a different thing and such a different topic. There are a lot of young people in Virginia on the Republican side who are going to I think after this year, especially, are going to be, start fighting more towards no conventions and to start looking for reform in that. And I think Dylan put it right, especially considering that the statewide party is not looking to do a convention for the 3 statewide races in 2021. I think there's possibility that this could be the last year where we see nominating conventions as is in Virginia. I think that is definitely a likely possibility.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and what Bob Good did, frankly, was incredible, which is he had raised very little money. He'd raised basically nothing. What money he did raise, rather than being spent on appealing to the voters, was spent on appealing to committee members who probably already agreed with him to begin with. Obviously, he had this at his own church. It was a drive-through. This just combined with all this, really, I think there is going to be, like you said, some pressure to get rid of this kind of antiquated system where you have these conventions instead of primaries, like basically everyone else in the country does. I mean,
sorry, if you think about it, his strategy makes perfect sense. That seat is fairly Republican. I mean, it's not a safe district, but it definitely leans Republican.
Yeah, it voted for Corey Stewart over Tim Kaine. Yeah,
so raising nothing and targeting very specific delegates is the right strategy. You're basically guaranteed the seat if you're normal.
Yeah, Riggleman wasn't doing the same thing. To his credit, Riggleman wasn't spending his fundraising money on that.
No,
again, and we've talked about this before. Bob Good winning that primary has put the 5th district in play for the Democrats. This seat would not be in play if Denver Riggleman was still the candidate. I think anyone from any side would agree with that. Bob Good has caused problems. He has still been unable to fundraise. He just now created an Instagram account because I know it, because he just followed my college's CR's account 2 days ago, and he just created one, and it's less than 2 months to the to the election. So this is a guy who's just getting off the board now on certain social media sites. That should cause some concern.
His biggest political experience before this was nothing. He was the athletic director at Liberty for a while, and nobody at Liberty endorsed him. Jerry Falwell Jr. Endorsed, if I recall right, Denver.
He endorsed Riggleman.
Yeah, so it was just a very unusual situation. But combined with these two things, I'm still at the point where how have they not delivered the ballots yet?
Yeah,
that seems like something you do. Like as soon as they're finished, you deliver them. Just the appearance there is bad, regardless of if there's malfeasance or not. It's like the sort of stuff we talked about in like King County back in the 2004 governor election. Regardless of those ballots were legitimate or not, and there's reason to think both ways. The fact that they were being found, days or weeks after the election isn't a good thing. It's very similar here. If you're finding these sorts of things and in this case they can count and know these ballots are fake. Like these ballots were cast by people who shouldn't have voted, or there are more ballots cast than eligible voters. Because you actually have that here. So the whole thing is just astounding in my opinion. It shows honestly a lot of the problems of the Virginia Republican Party to begin with, just as an organization at this point.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely. But I think we've gone over this issue about enough, so we're probably going to move on here to the Bob Woodward stuff. So for those who have been paying attention, Bob Woodward is a pretty well-acclaimed journalist. He's been doing this for a long time. He's nearly 80 years old. He's basically interviewed a ton of presidents, and he interviewed. Watergate scandal was one of his big things that he broke on, but he's interviewed many other presidents since, and it's generally not been good for those presidents. So Donald Trump decided it was a great idea to do 18 interviews with Bob Woodward, all on the record, all with audio, and they're already starting to come out, and they're already bad.
Yep.
So the first one that came out a couple days ago was about 2 COVID interviews. So, COVID, Trump, at first in these interviews was very noncommittal on COVID, said initially like it was very dangerous. It was 5 times more dangerous than the flu. And then in later ones said he was purposely downplaying it so as not to cause a panic. You can debate the validity of that strategy, but the fact that his words are saying that is basically pure campaign fire for the Biden campaign. There's really no positive way to spin this. You can say, I mean, I think even Tucker Carlson last night was like, the real villain here is Lindsey Graham, because Lindsey Graham told him to do an interview with Bob Woodward, but it was Trump that was pushing for this interview. He really thought that he could, get his opinions well. He thought he knew Bob Woodward. I think Jared Kushner was supportive of this as well, of interviews with Bob Woodward. And whereas everyone with a brain was telling him, are you crazy? Because there's no good scenario as a president, generally speaking, when you do an interview with Bob Woodward. The guy is just out for blood. I mean, he does not hold back in terms of stuff. And I mean, there's another leak today. I mean, if you want to go over the one today, Dylan, that was about as bad, I think, was over the king of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that one won't get nearly as much play. But honestly, in terms of pure corruption, that one's worse. Mm-hmm. The COVID one is bad, but it just puts audio to what we knew Trump's strategy was all along. This is really just the Biden campaign getting an audio clip to put in their ads.
Yeah. It got what was generally known, which was, I mean, that he had been downplaying it initially. Honestly, about the only thing that would have been damaging would be him saying, I was doing this because I wanted to save a trade deal with China. Like, that would be basically the worst that he could do. That was the general assumption early on, was his praise of China and their leadership was in a direct attempt to, salvage the trade deal he was trying to work out. But he didn't say that.
Don't rule out that that's coming.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, Trump is loose-lipped. The problem seems to be people never get him on video saying the really crazy stuff behind the scenes. Bob Woodward got it on audio, and he's got 16 more of these things apparently. So if they're all as damaging as this one, I mean, the second one, as Dylan was getting at, was over. The king of Saudi Arabia was accused of assassinating a journalist. And this was generally assumed, to be the work of the Saudi Arabian government. Bob Woodward got Trump on audio saying that he had gotten Congress off of the king of Saudi Arabia's back. That he was was bragging about, his protection of this guy who, I mean, you can agree on whether or not the assassination was justified or if it was really an offense that warranted, excommunication. But all things considered, or not the king of Saudi Arabia, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, known as, he's tried to develop relations with the West to a pretty solid degree, and he's been fairly successful bringing in industry. So in that regard, he's seen as a Western-friendly guy, right? So Trump was acting more or less in what some people would say would be good interest, but he shouldn't have said this. This is something you just don't say, especially not to a journalist who is known for revealing your dirty secrets.
Yeah. Trump is usually really concerned about leaks, but he delivered this one on a silver platter. I mean, but I think this is kind of textbook Trump. He doesn't see what he's doing as bad, wrong, inadvisable. He really doesn't think he can do any wrong.
Yeah.
That's who he is.
And if something wrong happened, it's obviously because someone else did something wrong.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
So he does these interviews and says these really damaging things. And he probably saw the coverage to this and thought, what did I say that was wrong? The whole, I downplayed COVID to not cause a panic. That wouldn't be bad if he had done something else to fix the problem. A lot of presidents downplay crises to not cause a panic. That's not abnormal. But when you're seen as largely ignoring the problem, getting caught saying, oh yeah, I downplayed it, I knew it was dangerous, and yet I still held rallies where prominent Republican officials died.
Herman Cain.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really bad look.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys put it right in that Trump is loose-lipped. And, loose-lipped sinks ships, and his loose lips are sinking this White House even more so than I think we maybe could have even thought possible. You never know how this is going to play out. You never know in this day and age how much is it going to stick, because it sometimes feels like, one thing will stick and then something else just goes off and disappears entirely. So, we're still very early on in this process. You're never going to know where this stuff is going to stick or how it's going to stick. But either way, I think both comments, especially I think theoretically, the second one should be even more damning than the first one. I think Dylan put it right. The idea of playing down a crisis is something that we have seen many presidents do to make sure that the public does not go into total fear mode. That is something we have certainly seen presidents do before. Obviously, with what's happened beforehand, that does not look great. But I do think if you look at it in total way, saying that, hey, I told Congress to shut up and not investigate this guy because I wanted to make sure we got a good trade deal with him, and he might have been part of assassinating a journalist. I think that is something that is very concerning, that someone would be willing to go out and say, yeah, for the betterment of this deal, I told Congress don't investigate this guy, even though basically every other G6 nation is that, and they still were able to go ahead and make a good deal with these guys. So it's I would say, and again, I agree with Dylan that it won't get as much coverage as it probably should deserve, because we have moved far beyond that compared to maybe without COVID. I'm sure that would be much bigger news, but what we are right now, that's going to get blown past, even though it probably shouldn't be, because that is something that is very important, that the president interfered with congressional investigations.
Yeah, I don't think that either of these stories on their own are beyond the pale for a president, but they're usually the things that a president has done that they won't admit to.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Telling Congress not to investigate a foreign official to get favorable foreign policy from them, I don't think is beyond the pale for a president to do.
Yeah.
I think that's fairly standard fare, but you don't admit to it to a journalist.
Yeah. People like to believe that the governments are moral objectors. I don't personally believe that. I've never personally believed that, but that they like to believe that. So it's incredible. Yeah, I think it's still shocking for a lot of us to hear someone in that position of power just come out and say it, which I don't think he's necessarily wrong, but it's very shocking, and it's, I think, damaging to our efforts in foreign policy that we have someone, the president, coming out and saying these things to journalists.
Yeah, that will have far more significant long-term ramifications than the coronavirus tape will.
Yep, agreed. The question is, what comes next out of these interviews? Obviously, he's got more of them. You would think the most interesting ones would be front loaded. So if all of this is pretty much small cakes after this, it'd be there. But it's still, do you think there should be consequences for the advisors who advised him to do this, or do you think really they need to be more active in telling Trump don't do this sort of thing? Obviously, it may be too late at this point, given he's trailing in the polls. But if he were to win another 4 years, the last thing he wants is to have his end up like George Bush did at the end of his tenure, where you're facing massive congressional deficits in part because of your unpopularity. And that would seem kind of inevitable if stuff like this keeps coming out because of his own loose lips, his own problems with keeping his mouth shut.
Yeah, this has Kushner all over, in my opinion. In my opinion, this seems to have the idea of this guy who for some reason thinks, maybe this guy, because he's from the area and he's known us before and he knows me, he'll be able to be the right guy to talk for you to talk to. He won't leak anything, I promise. This will all come out after your presidency. Get out your frustrations and get out all your crap now. You'll be fine. And now we are less than 2 months to the election, and Bob Woodward, as he has done many previous times before, has once again leaked out stuff on an administration. So this smells of Kushner, in my opinion. This smells of his fingers. I have no clue what Tucker Carlson is doing, blaming Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham is one of the more competent politicians in Washington, D.C., in my opinion. I think, and he's been around in Washington since the 90s. I think he knows for good well what Bob Woodward would do to an administration. This seems to me like that this is the doing of the president's usual outsider advisors who have no clear idea what's actually gone down with Woodward in Washington before.
Mm-hmm.
So I do want to say that if it is Lindsey Graham, this was almost certainly not incompetence. This was him trying to get rid of a president he's never liked. I don't think his words before the election were all lies. But no, I totally agree. This is Kushner. And will there be consequences? No. Kushner has screwed up a lot of things. He's messed up a lot of easy things for Trump, and nothing's happened to him. So I think he'll stick around. Sorry.
It's 2 months to the election now. What are you going to do? Are you going to fire one of your highest profile advisors 2 months before an election?
If you don't think Trump has the poor political instincts to do that.
I know. I don't see that. But yeah, like you said, Jared's different because of his connection to the family. Trump's kind of like, Trump appreciates those connections clearly. That's what the president does. He quite clearly appreciates connections to the family, at the very least in some way. And at least to him, it seems like he considers Kushner an extension of that, being married to his favorite child. It's just a thing, though, where we've seen time and time again. You can be an outsider to come into Washington, but you can't be a guy who surrounds yourself with outsiders also. And that's what Trump has done here. He surrounded himself with a bunch of outsiders, and now we've seen it time and time again where that has come off worse for him than it has helped him in trying to do any of the legitimate things that he wants to do as president.
Yeah, Trump really should have. Trump and Biden should have been following the same campaign strategy. Basement. Don't talk to anybody. Don't tweet anything. Minimal presence. But Trump's incapable of that. That's not who he is. So he has to tweet. He has to do interviews. He has to do press conferences where he says really incriminating things that only hurt him. The only one who can lose Trump the election is Trump, and he seems to be doing a fantastic job of that.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to find a whole lot of arguments here.
No, I don't think I will.
Yeah. So I guess we've kind of gone over the Woodward stuff. So last thing we have on our docket here for the night is the recent polling that's come out. So obviously you had polling today from a number of firms. You've also had polling over the last week or so. The main thing that's been going on is obviously polls of states. There's a big drop from AARP. There was a pollster affiliated with them who polled, I believe, many swing states. I think it was probably like 8 or 9 swing states, or 7 or 8, something along that line. And the results were very consistent, which is that every single race is competitive to some degree. Like they had Senate races, all of them, even Colorado, within 5 points, which is kind of phenomenal and kind of gives you an idea of just how swingy election day could be. So I'll kind of go over these results at the moment from this pollster, Beniston Strategy Group. So this is the Senate polls. In Arizona, they had Mark Kelly up by 3. They had Gary Peters up by 4 in Michigan. They had Cal Cunningham up by 3 in North Carolina. They had Ernst up by 5 in Iowa. Loeffler up by 4 in the special election primary, and then Ossoff up by 1 in the general election overall in Georgia. Hickenlooper up by 5 in Colorado. Sarah Gideon up by 1 in Maine, and Steve Daines up by 3 in Montana. They also did races at the presidential, or polls of the presidential races in these states, and they were a little bit more varied. For example, Arizona had a +1 lead, Michigan had a +7. So in some of these states, but in North Carolina it was tied. So obviously some of these you had the Republicans outperforming Trump, and in others you had them underperforming, which is interesting compared to most other polls, which has been consistently that most Republicans are underperforming Trump, or the baseline of Trump in a lot of these states, aside from, like, for example, your John Cornyn's or even your Susan Collins's, who are polling a little bit above where Trump is. So just what are your thoughts on these polls first and foremost, and then what are your thoughts on what the general polling environment seems to be headed overall?
To me, this type of polling shows to me what the Democrats' biggest challenge in the Senate is, and that is getting over 50 seats. We know how they can get, we know how they can get to 50. We know that with a Biden presidency, that means they will hold the Senate. But the difference between 50 and 51 is legitimately action on climate. And we know how big climate is, especially to the younger base of Democratic voters and just younger voters in general. We know how big climate is as an issue. If you are stuck at 50, that means Joe Manchin holds all the power when it comes to climate votes. And we know how Joe Manchin will vote. That means that if it is at 50 votes, I personally would predict if we are at a 50-50 deadlock Senate, even with a Biden presidency, we will not see him put political energy into climate because that could potentially be a failing issue in the Senate. Mm-hmm. So, the question starts to be, where's 51? Is 51 Iowa? Is 51 Montana? Is 51 one of the Georgia races? You never really know. And even though the Georgia polling shows Ossoff up 1, if it ends at 48-47 for Ossoff, then we head to a runoff in December, which still theoretically could favor Republicans. I know Kraz Greinitz, who's another one of our fantastic authors, has written about how those runoffs in Georgia are not necessarily slam dunks for Republicans. But historically, we saw this in the Georgia Secretary of State race last year, I believe, in which that race went to a runoff, but then the Republican, I believe, triumphed by 5 points in that race, I believe, in 2018. So, it might not be a slam dunk, but it's fair to say that Republicans would be favored. So I think, to me, the big thing is that, one, it's quite clear that the Democrats, it's got to start to question, where does seat number 51 come from? And number two, I do think we are starting to see some tightening. I think, especially in the Rust Belt states, I think in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, we've started to see some tightening. I think in the Sun Belt also, I think maybe even more so than the Rust Belt, we've seen some tightening of polls. Arizona has looked closer in recent weeks. Texas has looked better for Trump in recent weeks. I think Florida and North Carolina have certainly looked better for Trump in recent weeks. I know a lot of people are focusing on that Rust Belt section. Obviously, Trump needs to keep one of those states to win, so I understand why. But if you look at the Sun Belt and South area polling, he is, I think, clearly doing slightly better in recent weeks down there than he is in the Rust Belt. And I think that's where you're starting to see the tightening really happen, is that some Republicans are maybe starting to come home in those races where they might be swingy but slightly tilting Republican states. I think that's where you're starting to really see the big change here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the states you're seeing this in to a degree is North Carolina. Obviously, Tom Tillis is still underperforming Trump in this poll and in most other polling, but it's looking less like the double-digit deficit or high single digits to low single digits, which makes it more of an achievable win if Trump were to win North Carolina by 2 or 3 points, which still isn't unlikely. If you look at most polling consistently, North Carolina is like at the lower rung of swing states in terms of how open it is to Democrats right now. That's not to say it won't flip or it can't flip. It probably would at the moment. But overall, if you're a Republican and you want to get this back within 3 or 4 points or 4 or 5 points, you're a little bit more confident at that point than you were before, where it looked like an 8 to 11 point Biden win nationally. And that's the point where hopefully if you're a Republican, then Trump would be able to pull someone over the ticket. Obviously, most polls are showing, though, is that continued the coalescing it down ballot. I think another one that's interesting is Montana is looking a little bit less doable at this point for Democrats, at least at the Senate level. The House is, interestingly enough, kind of moved the other way, but the Senate seems to be kind of normalizing to a low single-digit Daines lead, is from what I've seen.
Yeah, it seems to be stabilizing at about 1 to 3 points for Daines, which is probably good for him, which is probably better for him than he was expecting. Bullock was an A+ tier candidate, but it's still Montana in a presidential year. It's going
and they're starting to hit him on some issues where he could have some problems. Specifically, I know they went after him on cap and trade today, and they've gone after him on the assault weapons vote, or his flip-flops basically during the presidential campaign, which are kind of ill-advised. You could tell he wasn't really planning to run for the Senate at that point. He really wanted to be president, and he was willing to accept a little bit more of a leftward shift. Whether or not that works, obviously, doesn't matter, but it does seem like, for example, that House race in particular with Greg Gianforte and Chris Coonley, I think, the lieutenant governor of Montana. Yeah, looks to be a little bit closer than thought. I know Republicans are really starting to try to pull out the guns there because they really don't want to lose that seat. In a close election, a state like Montana could actually help in a tied electoral college vote. It would actually be the person who wins Montana could actually be deciding who the next president is because of how we have our electoral system set up.
Yeah, I mean, Montana is really an interesting one. There's certainly starting to be a tier here where it feels like, is the governor's race the best race for Democrats? Is it the House race between Kathleen Williams and Matt Rosendale, who lost to John Tester in 2018? Or is it the Senate race? There's a lot of questions here. It does seem like, to me, from what I've heard, that the House race is probably the least likely that we're going to see Democrats pull out. It does seem like Rosendale has like a firm 5-6 point lead there, just kind of what you expect in a Montana House seat. I know Montana can go very, very red at the presidential level, but it has a long, long history of being much closer for congressional races, for governor's races, for state races. It just has a long history of that, but it does seem like, surprisingly, which is something that we did not expect at the beginning of the year, that surprisingly the House race might be the one that is potentially the least likely to go for the Democrats right now in Montana. And that's something that we could do a whole nother article or, video or live stream about. That's talking about Montana is something that we could go on for a whole other 45 minutes for. But certainly to see how it's playing out there right now.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting kind of looking at, some of the races like that, the kind of the tiers that are going on in that sort of race. Montana in particular, given it's gaining a second congressional district in all likelihood next cycle, if the Democrats manage to flip, this district, they're probably pretty well set up to hold one of those congressional districts going into 2022 with the new maps.
And that would be
that would be the
Western
set up to run,
I believe, right? Though a second district would be a Western district, correct?
Yeah, but obviously, if they could have someone move there regardless, or you just run, saying or influence how the lines are drawn to some degree if they hold the gubernatorial race. But regardless, having a winner in the seat would actually be pretty good for them long term to ensure a split delegation, because the general assumption is that a seat in Montana will go along the historic lines, which are east to west, with the eastern district, I believe, being the more Republican of the two, and then the western one being the more Democratic of the bunch, a little bit smaller. If I recall right, I could be getting the order wrong there, but it's an interesting state to look at, to be sure. Another one I really want to see more polling from is Kansas. We have this at likely Republican, and it still seems likely Republican, but Republicans have started pouring a little more money into the race, whether it's a precaution or whether it's generally concerned that the race is competitive still. I'm not quite sure, but I do want to see more out of that state in particular.
Yeah, Bollier is a really good candidate. She was probably the best recruit the Democrats have. It's highly favored to go to the Republicans, but I think if you were looking at a potential likely Republican to flip to Democrat, it would either be Kansas or Alaska.
Yeah,
I would honestly say Alaska right now.
So would I.
Gross is having that independent label. He doesn't have that D next to him. He might caucus with the Democrats, and I know that Sullivan came out with an ad recently where Gross basically admitted to that he was basically running as an independent because he knew it would be more favorable to him. So we'll see if that sticks at all in that race. But I think if I were to choose a race that'd be closer right now, I would say Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
Roger Marshall is just such an extraordinarily much stronger candidate than Chris Kobach would have ever been, for sure. And
Kobach might even be trailing right now. If you just look at just the fundamentals here, it seems like Republicans made a really good choice in that race.
Yeah, and I think Marshall's, the fact that he was the first district congressman, the fact that he could potentially drive up numbers there to potentially turn off any stuff that happens in the third, maybe even the second congressional district. The fact that he can drive up numbers there could be something that could turn out to be really crucial for this race.
Yeah. The one that I think is interesting purely from how close it is Arizona. Mark Kelly only being up by 3 is very different from what we've seen in recent polling. A lot of the recent polling has had Kelly up by high single to even high double digits. So I don't know. I tend to think that these polls were just commissioned by Toss Up Bot. Because these are close no matter where it is. And I don't know, both Colorado and Arizona being really close makes my eyebrows go up a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, I mean, Cory Gardner is not a terrible incumbent. He is not someone who is going to be demon doled, I don't think. And I think, Arizona could see tightening if Republicans are starting to coalesce along with Sally. I do think that, I forget who it was from, but that plus 17 poll for Kelly, I definitely do think that was an outlier.
Sure.
But, I think, again, we're going to have to wait another week. We're going to have to wait another 2 weeks. Once we're officially really set in stone, no more polls will be taken from anyone in August or anyone at the end of August. So all be voters who will be making their choices after September, where it comes from. We've heard reports that NYT is likely to do some type of polling soon. Maybe live polling is coming back, which would be very interesting to all of us, I think. But, again, it's 2 weeks. I think we've got to see what happens in these next 2 weeks. And then that's when I'm going to really start to feel confident saying, well, I think this race is going this way. I think this race is going that way. That's when people like us can really start to say, hey, this is what it's really starting to look like here.
Yeah. As for the presidential polling, Arizona being as close as it is a very good sign for Trump. He needs a win in Arizona. If he loses Arizona, I think it's safe to say that the race is probably going to Biden.
Mm-hmm.
Arizona's probably going to vote to the right of Michigan and probably Pennsylvania. So if he loses Arizona, I'm going to guess he's done. So Biden only being up by 1 should be very encouraging for him. And Pennsylvania seems to be tightening, as Joe said.
Yeah. Another state that's interesting is Florida. I know the Cook Political Report kind of angered some people today, and they moved, I believe it was them that moved Florida to toss-up from leans Democratic, but the polling there has definitely improved, especially among Hispanic voters. That one poll out of Miami-Dade County has to be really concerning, not just for Democrats statewide. You can win while losing Dade or only winning Dade by 17, but that's really concerning for the 2 Democratic incumbents there, Donna Shalala and Debbie Murkazil-Powell, who are facing really credible challengers in seats with large Cuban populations that historically voted Republican down ballot. Just obviously, Florida's been kind of an unusual state. It tends to vote to the right of the country to a degree, and it would not be surprising if it were to just be weird and just vote for Republican, even in maybe a bigger Democratic win at this point, because it's just a strange state. It seems like it started to develop kind of a really durable Rick Scott-sized Republican advantage in a lot of ways, where you have to do really well as a Democrat to start winning. I mean, I don't know if that's the long-term trend, if it was just 2018 messing with everyone's minds, but it is becoming a very unusual state overall, because there's not a lot of college-educated voters that Democrats can hope to flip. Their best hope is Cubans, who are a Republican-leaning constituency, and there seems to be an opening, but Trump seems to have kind of reversed the damage somewhat, not back to pre-Trump levels, but seems to have reversed it a bit. And there's still areas Republicans can gain. I mean, Democrats have opportunities, for example, in the Arizona, Orlando, Tampa Bay, Jacksonville, but Republicans have areas they can gain too. It's a very unusual state, a very balanced state. So I really want to see some more high quality polling out of Florida, because there's a very real chance it could be a pivotal state this cycle again. And that would be all ironies.
It would be very ironic, in my opinion, if Republicans flipped seats in South Miami and then lost and were unable to flip seats in Oklahoma or South Carolina. I feel like that would be very ironic if that were to happen. I feel like, and that would just be totally Florida, and just how that area works politically. We've talked about this again. Carlos Jimenez is a very legitimate candidate in Miami's 26, in Florida's 26. Maria Elvira Salazar, again, like she proved in 2018, is a very legitimate candidate for Florida's 27th. Both Democratic candidates there have their own certain set of weaknesses. Again, Florida is just another state where we can go on for hours and hours about, because it is just the weirdest state politically in the union.
Well, hold on. There's been something very important that was missed. You can't take the night from Donna Shalala. So how do you hope to beat her? No, seriously, Florida's bizarre. And Cook moving it to leans Democratic was premature.
Or to begin with when they moved it.
Yeah, that state should just be in permanent toss-up after 2018, just to be safe. And yeah, those two incumbents, Mariska Powell and Shalala, are in real danger. That that Marist poll, the one that had the state tied, is really bad for Biden. But yeah, leave it to Florida to vote to the right of Arizona and North Carolina.
Yeah. I mean, and you think about it, if Republicans manage to hold places like Ohio and North Carolina and Georgia, at that point, and they managed to win Florida, at that point, Democrats are relying on not only, flipping Arizona, but also, holding places like, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, New Hampshire, and Nevada. There's a lot of weird coalitions that could come if Trump manages to win Florida.
I want to see some high quality polling out of Minnesota. I think that's the one Clinton state that is kind of ripe for a flip.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that to start the cycle, but the polling is coming increasingly close there. It's looking like one of the better swing states for Trump in general. And obviously you want more high quality polling, but the fact that Biden is going there already, having a rally there tomorrow, I believe, or having an event there, I think is indicative of the feeling they're having on the ground. I know Republican sources that I know, some of them are not really that optimistic about Minnesota, but most people weren't optimistic about Michigan either. And then it flipped. If you don't pay attention to a state, it can go away. And a state like Minnesota, which is just so weird politically, very highly mobilized, voter base, it would not be impossible for it to happen. It voted to the right of the country last time. First time it had done that since, I believe, the 60s or the 50s. So that's another one to keep an eye on. Obviously, if Trump starts flipping states like Minnesota, Democrats can still win. They can still have a coalition if they win Arizona. If Republicans manage to win Arizona, or basically, I'll go ahead and share a map just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. So this is a map I just whipped up in 270 to win. We don't usually do maps here, but I figured this would give an idea. So here's Florida. This is an unusual map. So Minnesota and Wisconsin are interchangeable here. They're both 10 electoral votes. So obviously, either of them, it doesn't really matter which one it is. But if you take that away from the Democrats, right there, you take Maine 2 away, they're at 269. And so if Trump would be to win either, win Minnesota or win something along this line, win Minnesota and Michigan, that would make up for losing Pennsylvania. If he wins Arizona, all of a sudden there's other options that pop up as well. But just overall, the map, people thought this would be pretty simplistic. It would be Biden wins back all the Rust Belt, and he wins back some of the Trump, Romney Obama states, Trump Obama states, in the Sun Belt and that sort of areas. That's still possible, but from what the vantage point I'm looking at, I described this in the most recent race ratings, which is that there is a change occurring in the Sun Belt in places like Georgia and Texas, and to a lesser degree North Carolina, where they're shifting a little bit to the left. But it's not at the same speed that you're seeing places like Minnesota or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, even Michigan, moving. These areas moved very quickly in one cycle, and it doesn't look like they're snapping back to pre-Trump levels. At most, they're stabilizing somewhere in the middle, and at worst, they're around the same point they were last time, just without the third parties to interfere with things. So as we get closer to Election Day, and maybe if the polls get closer or they get worse, we'll see a little bit of a clearer picture. But to me, it looks like the electoral map is looking interesting, at least. Overall, there's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, it's going to come down to, in the next couple of weeks, what the dominant narrative is. I think if the Woodward tapes and the coronavirus are the dominant headline, Biden's looking pretty safe. But that could very easily not be the dominant narrative. We have a very schizophrenic media. They like to jump around. They like to cover news stories. So if Trump gets even a week of good coverage, we might actually see things start to move in his direction even more.
Very true.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll keep you posted, of course, on elections daily as the week continues and as the cycle continues. I believe we're due for a ratings update at the end of the week.
I believe this Monday. Eric. I believe it is our next ratings.
Yep. And we may have some changes. I know there's some other outlets have moved states like Nevada back into the leans column. But we have a lot of stuff we're keeping an eye on, including in the Senate category. So stay tuned this Monday for that race ratings update, and stay tuned, of course, tomorrow for the World Tonight, which Pete should be back on that podcast tomorrow. That's at 5:00 Eastern. So be sure to tune in for that, and be sure to, if you haven't already, if you're watching us on YouTube, to like and subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate your support. And if you're listening to this on podcast platforms, give us a thumbs up or 5-star rating, whatever they allow you to do. We really appreciate your support. So thank you guys for listening and watching. Where can we find you guys on social media?
You can find me on Twitter at Joseph Szymanski. That is JOSEPHSZYMANSKI.
Mm-hmm.
You can find me on Twitter at Dylan B Wade1, DYLAN B Wade1. And you can find my podcast, Popcorn Politics, on ochelli.com, OCHELLI.com,
Yeah.
Tuesdays, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time.
Yeah. Sometimes I'm a guest on there, so when that happens, I usually tweet it out, but he's usually got a good show, so be sure to tune in for that as well. So, again, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you on next week's episode of Elections Weekly.